time.
That guy. That guy. No, wait till you hear me do it. So the guy, he goes, I say, I'll be the guy.
Okay.
A moth goes into a podiatrist's office.
A moth goes into a podiatrist's office, right?
You are correct. A moth goes into a podiatrist's office, and the podiatrist's office says, "What's the problem?" And the moth says, "What's the problem? Where do I begin, man?" He goes, "I go to work for Gregory Olinovich, and all day long I work." Honestly, Doc, I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. I don't even know if Gregory Olinovich knows. He only knows that he has power over me, and that seems to bring him happiness. But I don't know. I wake up in a malaise, and I walk here and there. The podiatrist says, "Oh, yeah?" And the moth goes, "Yes." And he goes, at night, I sometimes wake up and I turn to some old lady in my bed that's on my arm. A lady that I once loved, Doc. I don't know where to turn to. My youngest, Alexandria.
I can't tell you this.
She fell in the cold of last year. The cold took her down, as it did many of us. And my other boy. And this is the hardest pill to swallow, Doc. My other boy, Gregaro Ivanilidovich.
Anyone else in the business. Doing simple, really fucking well is an art form.
I no longer love him. As much as it pains me to say, when I look in his eyes, all I see is the same cowardice that I catch when I take a glimpse of my own face in the mirror. If only the cowardice was stronger, then perhaps I could bring myself to reach over to that cocked and loaded gun that lays on the bedside behind me and end this hellish facade once and for all.
How long a drive was this? Do you live in the valley? Where do you live? Please, sorry.
He says, "Doc, sometimes I feel like a spider, even though I'm a moth, just barely hanging on to my web with an everlasting fire underneath me. I'm not feeling good." And so the doctor says, "Moth, man, you're troubled. But you should be seeing a psychiatrist. Why on earth did you come here?" And then the moth said, "Because the light was on."
My congratulations to anyone who stuck it through to the end.
Sometimes the smallest things can be one of the biggest headaches. During the Apollo missions of 1969 to 72, the tiny particles of lunar dust turned out to be a major issue. Described as being as fine as talc but as rough as sandpaper, it also had properties that made it dangerous for both men and machines, and has been cited as a bigger problem for future astronauts than radiation by some scientists. The lunar surface is covered in a thin layer of dust which has been created by the bombardment of meteorites and micrometeorites over millions of years. These smash into the moon's surface at speeds of up to 12 miles or 20 kilometers per second, heating up and pulverizing rocks and dirt which contain silica and metals such as iron. Some of the dust is melted in the extreme heat of the impact, which creates tiny glass beads as the silica melts and then cools and falls back to the surface. This continual smashing shatters the silica and other minerals to produce finer and finer grains of dust. But because there is no weathering on the moon like there is here on Earth, the edges of these tiny shards, which are not only very hard, they also remain very sharp and jagged, which makes it incredibly abrasive and potentially damaging to anything it sticks to. NASA had an idea about the dust before the manned moon missions from the previous Surveyor landers, but it quickly became apparent that once men were there, the dust was going to be far more of a problem than they first thought. In fact, before the mission started, some scientists thought that because the dust had not been in contact with oxygen, that it may spontaneously combust if exposed to air. Before the departure of Apollo 11 from the moon, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong had to carry out a rather ad hoc experiment to see if the dust was safe to bring back into the lunar lander in an air environment. They got a grab sample of dust and went back to the lander. They placed some of it on the engine cover of the ascent module. They then closed the hatch and repressurised the cabin, whilst looking out to see if the dust started to smoke. Luckily, it didn't, and they got on with the departure. Aldrin said later that if it had, they would have stopped the pressurisation, opened the hatch and thrown it out as quickly as possible. We've seen the astronauts bouncing around on the moon's surface and getting covered in lunar dust. They also found that the dust sticks to anything it comes into contact with, from the sun visors on the helmets to gauges, dials, tools, and more importantly things like seals on the spacesuits and containers for bringing back the rock samples. The dust is electrically charged by the bombardment of charged particles from the sun, and this is what makes it stick to anything it lands on. During Apollo 17, crew members Harrison Jack Schmitt and Gene Cernan had reported that the dust was making it difficult for them to move their arms around during the moonwalks because it had got into the joints of their spacesuits. It also scratched the gold visors on the helmets to such an extent when they tried to wipe it off that it made it difficult to see, a bit like trying to clean glass with sandpaper. The same applied to cameras and other optical surfaces which had to be cleaned with a small camera cleaning brush to avoid damage. It also damaged the seals between the gloves and the spacesuit locking rings so that they started to slowly leak air in the vacuum on the moon's surface. Just how abrasive the dust is was revealed when it wore through almost 3 layers of a Kevlar-like material on Schmidt's moon boots as he made his way around the lunar surface. The Apollo missions brought back 382 kilograms of rock samples. These were placed into sealed containers to keep in the low-pressure atmosphere of the moon in with the samples. However, when they got back to Earth, it was found that every sample box had leaked air in from the cabin because the dust had damaged the seals on the containers. There was also no way to isolate the crew from the dust in the lander cabin either. There were no airlocks and nowhere to change out of their suits other than in the cabin. When the crews returned to the lander and repressurised the cabin, on every mission they noticed that some of the dust became airborne and floated around the cabin, not only coating the inside of the craft, but they also breathed it in as well. They said that it had the smell of spent gunpowder or wet ashes in a fire. And after the mission, Cernan said that it took about 3 months for the embedded dust to grow out from under his fingernails. On Apollo 17, Schmitt said that he felt congested and complained of lunar dust hay fever, but the symptoms disappeared the next day. It's because of this that the crews were put into quarantine when they first returned to Earth, because no one knew if there were any biological threats on the moon or in the dust. Although by Apollo 12 this had been discontinued as it had been confirmed from examination on Earth that it posed no bacterial or viral risks. Although the dust is mostly silica and non-poisonous, the extremely small size of the particles posed a similar problem to that which had been discovered when miners and tunnellers on Earth had become ill and died of silicosis years after dry drilling. Silicosis is where the tiny dust particles are so small that it gets into the very deepest parts of the lungs and cannot be coughed out. The white blood cells of the immune system cluster around the particles and the victim eventually dies as the lungs become more and more ineffective. Another problem with the dust and the lack of a lunar atmosphere also came to light again with the Apollo 12 mission. When they landed, it was about 180 metres or 600 feet from an earlier Surveyor 3 lander, which had been there for a couple of years. The Apollo 12 astronauts detached the camera and mechanical scoop from the Surveyor lander for return to Earth. Whilst doing this, they noticed that the structure of the lander had been darkened by the cosmic radiation of the time, but some areas had effectively been sandblasted clean by the dust blown out by the rocket engine exhaust from Apollo 12 as it landed. This was confirmed when the camera and mechanical scoop were examined back on Earth, as they had been damaged by the high-speed particles of dust. It's now believed that some of the smallest particles of dust that were ejected by the blast from the engine, which can also be seen from the landing footage, could have been blown halfway around the moon due to the lack of atmospheric resistance, although most of it would have only gone as far as high-sided craters or nearby mountain ranges before it was stopped. It's estimated that the lunar soil, or regolith, and the dust had been travelling at about 1,300 feet or 400 metres per second, which is as fast as a bullet from a gun. This means in future, craft landing near other structures, buildings or even astronauts could cause damage to them by this sandblasting effect, even at some distance away. For future manned journeys to the moon, NASA and scientists around the world have been working on ways to control the dust using technologies like film coatings that the dust won't stick to and shaking the dust off with an electric charge. As the dust particles contain tiny pieces of nanophase iron or pure iron, and this is affected by a magnetic field, this could be used to extract the dust from the air in filtration systems. So if you thought that the dust in your house was a pain, just be thankful that it's not lunar dust. Anyways, I hope you found this little piece interesting and informative, and if you did, then please subscribe, rate and share, and also check out some of our other videos which you may be interested in. So until the next time, it's goodbye from me.
We are all the products of the decisions that we and others make every single day of our lives. But some decisions have repercussions that are sometimes so far-reaching that they can affect everybody on the planet. In this video, we've picked out 5 decisions that changed the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the closest we have come to a nuclear conflict, and many thank Kennedy for facing down the Soviets by blockading Cuba and turning away the Soviet supply ships. But the more important decision was for Kennedy to ignore the advice of General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff. General Curtis LeMay clashed with Kennedy and said that the blockade was a weak political action that would lead to war. He suggested he should be allowed to bomb the Cuban nuclear missile sites, and that would force Moscow to back down instead of facing a nuclear shootout. But what he and others in the US didn't know at the time was that the Soviet field commanders in Cuba had been given authority to launch nuclear weapons independently of Moscow. There were at least 20 nuclear warheads, each with a 1 megaton capability, and medium-range missiles that could reach as far as Washington, as well as 9 tactical nuclear missiles, all stationed on Cuba at that time. This meant that if LeMay had gotten his way and had attacked the missile sites, there was a very high probability that the Soviet commanders would have launched a nuclear attack on the US mainland before Moscow could have reacted. This would have led to millions of US casualties, and the ensuing retaliation by the US Strategic Air Command, again led by LeMay, would have killed upwards of 100 million Soviets. In the end, Kennedy's hunch was right, and the blockade worked. And after secretly removing US missiles from Turkey and Italy, the Soviets backed down and removed their missiles from Cuba. If you celebrate Christmas, or you enjoy having Sunday off of work, then you've got to thank one man almost 1700 years ago for his decision to adopt a minor religion that had been persecuted for almost 200 years, and it's not Jesus Christ. That man was the Roman Emperor Constantine, and his religious conversion took place during the Civil War, when the Roman Empire was effectively in 2 parts, with Constantine coming from Britain in the west and Maxentius ruling the east and holding on to Rome. Christianity back then was a banned religion because, amongst other things, Christians refused to participate in the imperial cult. This cult regarded the Roman emperors and members of their families as gods. Anyone who refused to acknowledge this was committing treason, which was punishable by death. In 312 AD, Constantine was about to fight a key battle in the war and prayed for divine help. Afterwards, he claimed to see a burning cross in the sky, and later that night he dreamt that God told him to use the sign of a cross on his soldiers' shields and on the standard to safeguard all his battles. Constantine defeated Maxentius in the Battle of Milvian Bridge and became the Western Emperor and continued to wear the cross to safeguard him against his enemies. Constantine became a Christian and became a great patron for Christianity. Shortly after he became emperor, he issued the Edict of Milan, which allowed Christians to freely practice their faith, and he went on to overturn hundreds of years of Roman pagan beliefs. He combined some of the old pagan worship rituals with Christian ones. He made December the 25th, which was the birthday of the pagan sun god, into a celebration of Christ's birth, and thus it became Christmas Day. He also made Sunday an official Roman holiday so people could attend church. He abolished taxes on Christian churches and funded Christian leaders and built new church buildings. By 394 AD, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire, and the Roman version of Christianity went on to become a hugely powerful Roman Catholic Church, which dominated much of Europe for well over 1,000 years before spreading around the world. It's difficult to say how the world would look if Constantine hadn't become a Christian, but one thing is for certain: without the monolithic power block of the Catholic Church, it would look very different to how it is today. Sometimes the actions of a single man's conscience can make a decision that can affect the future of a whole nation. On September the 11th, 1777, 12,500 British troops had landed on the northern end of Chesapeake Bay and were heading through Pennsylvania towards the Patriot capital of Philadelphia. Guarding their flank and hiding in the woods were a detachment of green-clad British marksmen on the lookout for American forces led by General George Washington. The marksman's commanding officer was Captain Patrick Ferguson, a 33-year-old Scotsman who was said to be the finest shot in the British Army. Ferguson and 3 of his men spotted a cavalry officer dressed in the colourful uniform of a European hussar, followed by a senior American officer wearing a high-cocked hat. They crept forward with the intention of picking off the officers, but then Ferguson had a sudden change of heart and felt disgust at the thought of shooting the officers in the back as they rode by, which would also have been dishonourable in the 18th century. Instead, Ferguson shouted at the men to dismount. They turned to see him and rode off. A few days later, Ferguson was shot in the arm and seriously wounded. It was at this point that he learned that the American officer that he let ride off was most probably General George Washington. Whilst Washington won the war, he was repeatedly outmaneuvered in battles by the British. Had Ferguson shot Washington on that day, it's possible that without Washington at the helm, coordinating the army, Congress, the state governors and their militias and supplies, that the revolution may well have failed and America would have remained a British colony. What could a decision made by a single random person about 6,000 years ago have on the whole of human history? Well, quite a lot, because that one person, be it a man or a woman, was the first to sit and ride on a horse, and that would change the course of human history completely and give us the first transport system that will continue for the next 6,000 years. At the time, horses had been hunted for about 100,000 years for their meat and skin. no one would have imagined that sitting on a 1,000-pound beast that could kill you with a single kick would transform humans from hunter-gatherers that could only travel as far and as fast as they could walk into travellers that would spread across continents and at speeds that would have seemed unbelievable. It allowed human culture to grow from isolated pockets into the interconnected world we have today. It was in the huge Eurasian steppe between Hungary and Mongolia where the first horseman arose some 6,000 years ago. Why someone decided to try and ride a horse for the first time, we will just never know. Humans are often predisposed to doing some pretty weird things, and whether it was just a dare or an idle thought by someone thinking, what would it be like to run as fast as a horse? Whichever way it happened, they managed to tame it and control it. You can only imagine what the other people would have thought when they saw them riding at speed on a horse. And of course, just like today, they all wanted one. It wasn't long before horses started showing up in places like Turkey and Switzerland, well away from the grassy plains of the steppe, and showed the beginnings of the main mode of human transport that would last until the invention of the internal combustion engine almost 6,000 years later. China is now the number 2 power in the world after the United States. But if it weren't for the decision of a new Chinese emperor in 1424, things could have worked out very differently, with China being the first to discover the New World long before the Europeans. We know that Columbus had discovered the New World in 1492, yet over 80 years earlier, the Chinese had created huge treasure fleets, and on 7 occasions between 1405 and 1433 they set out to find new lands and trade. These expeditions were led by the Chinese equivalent of Columbus, a great navigator called Cheng Ha. He created trading links from Taiwan to the Persian Gulf and to the east coast of Africa, all under the control of the Chinese court. They were also a show of force to the barbarian nations, but China had once again become the middle kingdom of the world. The naval technology was far in advance of that of the Europeans, with the largest vessels, called the treasure ships, being 9-masted junks, measuring 400 feet long by 150 feet wide, with 4 decks and watertight bulkheads and a crew complement of over 400. Compare that to Columbus's voyages over 80 years later, where the largest ship, the Santa Maria, was just 90 feet by 30 feet and with a crew of 90. It took the Europeans hundreds of years before they built ships as large as the Chinese treasure ships. Each of the Chinese expeditions consisted of over 300 ships with over 27,000 crew, soldiers, horses, supply ships, water tankers and patrol boats. With all these advantages, the Chinese were ideally placed to colonize the new undiscovered worlds, well before the Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese and British, but for the decision of the new Chinese Hongxi Emperor in 1424. Along with him came a new wave of Confucianism. He ordered the overseas voyages to stop as it violated long-standing Confucian principles and the new thinking that the enlightened Chinese had nothing to learn or gain from the barbarians. By 1500, the Chinese fleet was reduced to a fraction of its previous size, and so began the hundreds of years of Chinese isolationism and the colonization of the New World by the Europeans. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, then please thumbs up, subscribe, share and comment. And don't forget, we have other videos available which you may also find interesting on the link which is showing now. So until the next time, it's goodbye from me. For some people, when facing almost certain death, fate intervenes and decides that it is not their time to go. In this video, we look at 5 amazing stories of human survival. Wenceslao Miguel was a Mexican who was captured on the 18th of March 1915 after being suspected of taking part in the Mexican Revolution. He was summarily sentenced to death by firing squad without trial. He was shot 8 times in the body and then once in the head at point blank range by the commanding officer to guarantee his death, or so it seemed. There are differing stories as to how he survived. Some say he was found alive but unconscious amongst the bodies of the others that had been executed and given medical attention to recover. Others say he managed to crawl away to a church a few blocks away, where he was found by a church member who took him home and looked after him until he was well again. One thing that is known for sure, and that is he went on to live a full life until his death in 1975 at the age of 85. His remarkable story was brought to the world on July the 16th, 1937, when he appeared on Ripley's Believe It or Not radio show on NBC with the founder, Robert Ripley. On Christmas Eve 1971, 17-year-old Julianne Kopka boarded the Lancer Flight 508 bound from Lima in Peru to Pucallpa, also in Peru, with her mother, Maria Kopka. They were returning home for Christmas to see her father, Hans Wilhelm Kopka, at the nature reserve which he had founded a few years earlier. The plane, a Lockheed Electra turboprop, took off and about 40 minutes into the flight entered a violent thunderstorm. Julianne Kopka said that there was a lot of turbulence and lightning, and after about 20 minutes the plane was struck by lightning which set fire to a right-hand engine. The Lockheed turboprop wasn't built to fly in strong turbulence, and due to its very rigid wings, shortly after the lightning strike, the right-hand wing and part of the left wing broke away from the plane. The plane then broke into 2 pieces. Julianne, who was strapped into a bench seat, found herself falling from the plane at a height of about 10,000 feet. She said she remembered seeing the rainforest canopy approaching before she lost consciousness and then woke up the next day in the forest. Although she had broken her collarbone and had deep cuts to her arms and legs, she was, after a period of time, able to move around. Initially she was looking for her mother, and while doing this she found a bag of candy that had fallen from the plane too. This would be her only food for the next 10 days. Her father had taught her survival skills and said that if you ever get lost, all you need to do is find a river and follow it downstream and you'll always find people there. During her journey to escape the forest, she came across the bodies of 3 other passengers from the plane, still strapped into their seat and buried headfirst into the forest floor. After several more days of travel, she found a small boat and a hut by the river used by lumbermen. She fell asleep in a hut and awoke to the sounds of voices. The men were startled by the sight of a white-skinned blonde girl in the hut and thought she was a water spirit. She managed to tell them in Spanish what had happened, and they took her to a lumber village further down the river. From here, a local pilot volunteered to take her to a hospital in Pucallpa, run by missionaries, where she was reunited with her father. He then went on to help with the search parties to locate the crash site. It was later found out that up to 14 of the passengers had survived the crash and the fall to the forest, including her mother Maria. However, they had all died over the following days whilst awaiting to be rescued due to the severity of their injuries. When it comes to the great explorers of the Antarctic, most people will think of Scott, Shackleton and Amundsen, but one of the most amazing survival stories comes from the Australian explorer Douglas Mawson. Mawson set off on his expedition at the end of 1911, when Scott and Amundsen were racing to the South Pole. In fact, Scott had asked Mawson to join him on his ill-fated Terra Nova expedition, but he turned it down to lead his own expedition to map an unexplored area of the Antarctic continent. Mawson had worked as a geologist with Scott's rival Shackleton between 1908 and 1909. Mawson was also in a 3-man team which was the first to reach the Earth's magnetic South Pole. The expedition stayed through the Antarctic winter of 1911 at a camp at Cape Denison, which Mawson described as the windiest place on Earth, where the average wind speed was 50 miles an hour and with gusts of up to 200 miles an hour. When the 3-man team of Douglas Mawson, Xavier Mertz and Lieutenant Belgrave Ninnis started, they had 5 weeks of excellent progress. However, the first disaster struck whilst crossing the Ninnis Glacier. Mawson was on the sledge, with Mertz on skis and Ninnis jogging alongside the second sled. It was at this point when Ninnis fell through a snow bridge into an unseen deep crevasse. The party's 6 best dogs, most of the rations, their tent and other essential supplies fell into the massive crevasse. Mertz and Mawson spotted 1 dead and 1 injured dog on a ledge 165 feet below them, but Ninnis was never seen again. After a brief service, Mawson and Mertz turned back immediately, and with just 1 week's provisions for a 4-week journey for 2 men and no dog food for the huskies, they were forced to sacrifice the remaining sled dogs to feed themselves and the other dogs. This, ironically, only made things a lot worse. The men's condition quickly worsened, with Mertz, once a champion skier, rapidly deteriorating with skin, hair and nail loss, diarrhea and finally falling into madness. Mertz suffered further seizures before falling into a coma and dying on the 8th of January 1913. It wasn't known at the time, but husky liver contains very high levels of vitamin A, which affected both men adversely, but Mertz more so because he ate more of the livers. Mawson continued the final 100 miles, but he too fell through the lid of a crevasse, but was saved by the harness attached to his sled, which was wedged in the ice above him. Though weak and frostbitten, he managed to climb out of the crevasse and finally made it back to Cape Denison, only to find he was just 2 hours late for the boat which had set off after thinking the men had been lost. Luckily, 6 men had stayed behind to look for the missing party, so Mawson was forced to stay a second winter until the ship could return in the following spring. Mawson returned to Australia and years later was knighted and went on to lead other Antarctic expeditions. He died at the age of 76 in 1958. The 28th of July 1945 was meant to be the last day of work for Betty Lou Oliver at her job as an elevator operator in the Empire State Building, but it turned out to be almost her last day on Earth. That Saturday morning, William Franklin Smith Jr. was piloting a B-25 bomber on a routine personnel transport mission from Bedford Army Field to Newark Airport, New Jersey, when he became disoriented in thick fog and turned left instead of right when passing the Chrysler Building. At 9:40 a.m. in the morning, the plane crashed into the north side of the Empire State Building between the 78th and 80th floors. The impact created an 18-foot by 20-foot hole in the building, and the force of the crash sent one engine clean through the building and out the south side before landing on the next block 900 feet below. The other engine and part of the landing gear broke into an elevator shaft and fell to the bottom. 14 people, including 3 people on the plane, were killed, and the elevator operator, Betty Lou Oliver, was seriously injured. When rescuers reached Betty, they put her in the elevator to get medical help, but what they didn't know was that the engine that had gone down the lift shaft had cut many of the cables, so when the doors shut, the elevator car plunged 75 stories, or approximately 1,000 feet, to the bottom of the lift shaft into a sub-basement. The lift was saved from a sudden and devastating stop by the huge coils of cable at the bottom of the shaft, which had fallen after being cut by the engine. Betty survived the fall in the elevator car, but had to be cut from the wreckage, and despite having a broken back and legs, she fully recovered from her double escape from death within 8 months, and went on to have 3 children, 7 grandchildren. On October 28, 2005, 3 fishermen, Jesus Vidania, Lucio Rendon and Salvador Ordonez, set sail from the Mexican port of San Blas, Nayarit, to catch sharks in a 28-foot fiberglass boat. This should have been a routine fishing trip, but it turned into one of the longest survival stories for anyone being lost at sea. On the way to the fishing grounds, the boat had a mechanical problem and was caught in strong winds which blew them into the path of the northern equatorial current, which crosses the Pacific Ocean from Mexico to the Philippines. The boat had no radio, so they couldn't call for help, and they soon found themselves drifting out into the Pacific Ocean in a boat without hot food, food, sunscreen, bathroom or any engines. Although there were 3 men in the boat when they were rescued, it turned out there were 5 men originally. The boat owner and another man had hired the 3 fishermen for the fishing trip, but some think that they were picking up drugs, something which the 3 survivors vehemently denied. Videla said that after they realised they couldn't get back, they fashioned a sail out of blankets and were blown along by the wind and the current westwards. They were eventually picked up by a Taiwanese tuna fishing vessel on August the 9th, 2006, over 9 months later near the Marshall Islands and approximately 5,500 miles from where they started out on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. They said that they had survived by catching fish, turtles and seabirds, which they ate raw, and as it rained almost every day, they had fresh water to drink. The 3 survivors said that the 2 men that had hired them, including the boat owner, couldn't eat the raw food and they were constantly sick, and they had eventually starved to death within a couple of months of being at sea. When the men were rescued, they were very thin and hungry and suffering from exposure to the sun and salt water, but otherwise they were healthy. The men returned to Mexico as heroes and were reunited with their families. After a period of recovery and undaunted by their ordeal, they returned to their lives as shark fishermen. Thanks for watching and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then don't forget to please thumbs up and subscribe for more, and if you have any ideas for videos you'd like to see, then please let us know in the comments below. They say ignorance is bliss, and it may well be compared to knowing that you've missed out on millions or even billions of dollars because of bad decisions, bad advice or just bad luck that turns the dream of riches into the cold awakening of what could have been. In this video we'll look at 7 people that missed out on a fortune. Number 1. As the old timers would say, there's gold in them there hills, but in this case it's more like the local refuse dump. Back in 2009, just after Bitcoins had been created, British IT worker James Howells jumped on the Bitcoin mining bandwagon when it was still relatively easy to find them and set his Dell laptop to work digging for Bitcoins. After about a week of data mining, he stopped due to his girlfriend complaining about the noise the laptop was making. By then he'd found around 7,500 Bitcoins, but back then this was worth maybe $50 and no one knew what was going to happen to the value of the currency over the next few years. At its peak in November 2013, those 7,500 Bitcoins were worth $7.3 million, and even today they are still worth around $4.3 million. In 2010, the laptop broke down after he spilt lemonade into it. James stripped it down for spares and put the hard drive containing the digital Bitcoin wallet into a drawer and basically forgot about it for the next 3 years and got on with his life. 3 years later, in 2013, James was having a clear out, and one of the items he decided to throw away was the hard drive from the Dell laptop. At the time, he said, "I had a little voice in the back of my head saying that this wasn't a good idea, but I continued to throw it away." He only realised the error a few months later when he reconnected with the Bitcoin world, but by then the hard drive, which was the size of a credit card and about 1/4 of an inch thick, was long gone in the local landfill dump under about 4 to 5 feet of rubbish in an area the size of a football pitch, and presumably it's still there. James has looked into retrieving it, but the cost of doing so with no guarantee of finding it was too prohibitive. So, somewhere in Docksway landfill site near Newport in Wales, there is a pot of digital gold at the end of a rainbow of rubbish. Number 2. Life is a game. That's what Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari, the games console maker of the 1970s, said about business. If you lose a game of chess, You don't go and jump off a bridge, you just reset the pieces and start again. And he should know he has made some big mistakes along the way and admits that when he was 35, he was insufferable. He said, "I thought I could do no wrong and I got really sloppy." Wise and prophetic advice from a man that could have owned a third of Apple, which is now valued at over $540 billion, and for just $50,000. In the early days of Atari, Ron Wayne, we'll hear more about him later, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had been involved in developing the Atari arcade game Breakout. Later, using parts borrowed from Atari, Jobs and Wozniak created and marketed their own home computer. Jobs offered the design to Bushnell, but Atari wasn't interested in making computers at that time, so Bushnell turned it down. In 1976, Jobs again approached Bushnell, but this time for money to fund the fledgling Apple Computer Company. He was asking for $50,000 in exchange for 1/3 of the company. Bushnell said later about it, "I was so smart, I said no." And it's kind of fun to think about that when I'm not crying about it. Number 3. Who would have thought that a simple mispronunciation would cost you $1 million? But that's what happened to Wheel of Fortune contestant Julian Batt, who turned the game show into a wheel of misfortune. Julian was competing in the popular TV game show when he had a golden opportunity to win $1 million.
Empire under this one roof. The techs do the work buying, stealing, or producing, and all you need to worry about is selling the stuff, offloading illegal product, and bringing in nice, legal, laundered cash. Here's where you book the talent. Any DJs Dave is talking to will show up here. Then you can choose who you want in residence. Solomon is killing it up there right now, but if you feel like you need to freshen things up, there are some options. Then this is the warehouse page. You'll see any and all of the illegal businesses you own registered here. Assign a warehouse tech to the product you want to stockpile, and they'll use your established network to bring that in, at no additional cost or effort to you. You've got one tech at the moment, but you can hire additional people for additional products on this page too. This is the upgrades page. Improve security or modernize some of the equipment downstairs. Whatever you need to increase productivity. Come through to the nightclub management tab and you'll see some more numbers if that's your kind of thing. But more importantly, you can run promotions for the club by hitting, you guessed it, Promote Club. The staff, the DJs, me, we'll all be doing everything we can to run a banging night. But to get the buzz, increase popularity, and bring in cash, we'll need to promote it.
I only got this piece from the shoot. Anyway, I love it. Yay! Here's a window to nothing. And it's just a straight cut down. It's ribbed, which means it's going to contour to the body quite nicely. Now, some people either love ribs or hate ribs. I love ribs. Both ribs. Ribs on shirt and ribs on face.
Okay, good to see you're doing something to keep this club running.